June 8, 1944, dawned with a relentless, oppressive silence, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the previous day's landings. Deep in the Norman bocage, a few miles inland from the blood-soaked sands of Omaha Beach, near the shell-pocked hamlet of Colleville-sur-Mer, the silence was occasionally shattered by the crack of a sniper's rifle or the distant rumble of artillery. American forces, having clawed their way ashore, were now entangled in a brutal hedgerow fight, each field a microcosm of agony and defiance. For the medics, the battle was not just against the enemy, but against time and the very limitations of their training. They moved through the carnage, their white armbands stark against their olive drab, their kits filled with bandages, morphine, plasma, and tourniquets, tools designed for stabilization and evacuation. Their doctrine was clear: stop the bleeding, treat for shock, administer pain relief, and get the wounded to a field hospital as quickly as possible. The idea of performing complex surgery on the front lines, amidst the dirt and chaos, was not merely unconventional. It was considered an impossibility, a fantasy born of desperation that no responsible medical officer would ever countenance. They were not surgeons, they were first responders, the critical link in a chain that led to proper medical care, miles away. Yet this very war, with its unprecedented scale of trauma and the unforgiving nature of its battles, was about to challenge every deeply held belief about what was possible and what a single medic, pushed to the absolute brink, could achieve. This was a conflict that would redefine the boundaries of human endurance and medical innovation. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Today we delve into the extraordinary tale of a medic whose radical methods, initially dismissed as reckless and dangerous, would save dozens of lives under direct enemy fire, challenging the established medical orthodoxy of World War II and fundamentally altering the landscape of military trauma care. His story is one of innovation forged in the crucible of combat, a testament to individual courage, and a dramatic turning point in the relentless struggle to preserve life amidst overwhelming destruction. The battlefield was a grim laboratory, and the stakes were nothing less than the lives of American fighting men. His revolutionary approach would demonstrate that under certain dire circumstances, the line between medic and surgeon could, and sometimes must, blur. This was a narrative not just of medical procedure, but of a profound shift in mindset, driven by the stark realities of war. First Lieutenant Elias Vance of the Medical Detachment, 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, was not a typical medic. Before the war pulled him into its vortex, he was a brilliant, albeit unconventional, surgical resident at a prestigious university hospital in Boston. He had completed 3 years of a demanding general surgery program, demonstrating a keen intellect, exceptional manual dexterity, and an almost intuitive understanding of human anatomy. His professors recognized his potential, though they often found his willingness to question established protocols a source of both frustration and admiration. When the call to arms came, Elias, like so many others, put his surgical dreams on hold, exchanging the sterile environment of the operating room for the muddy fields of combat. He was commissioned as a medical officer, a medic, not a surgeon, and assigned to a frontline infantry unit. The prevailing medical doctrine of the time, known often as scoop and run, dictated that medics primarily focused on immediate life support. Their role was to control external bleeding, splint fractures, provide pain relief and ensure rapid evacuation to battalion aid stations, and then further back to field hospitals, where trained surgeons could perform definitive care. This system, while often effective for less severe injuries, struggled desperately with complex internal traumas. The battlefield situation in Normandy in early June 1944 was particularly grim for casualties with abdominal or chest wounds. German resistance was fierce, supply lines were often disrupted, and the dense hedgerows made evacuation slow and perilous. Many wounded soldiers, particularly those suffering from internal hemorrhages or perforated organs, would bleed out or succumb to shock long before they could reach a surgeon. Their prognosis was often fatal even with the best efforts of conventional field medicine. On June 10th, Private John Thompson, a young rifleman from Company C, took a bullet to the lower abdomen during a skirmish near a crossroads. When Elias Vance reached him, Thompson was conscious but pale, his breathing shallow, and his pulse thready. Blood welled around the entry wound, but Vance knew the true danger lay within. Thompson was visibly distending, a sure sign of internal bleeding. Corporal Thomas Jenkins, another medic in Vance's detachment, applied a pressure dressing and prepared a plasma transfusion. "We need to get him to the aid station, Lieutenant," Jenkins urged, his voice strained. "He's bleeding out." Vance knelt, his hands expertly probing Thompson's abdomen. He could feel the growing rigidity, the telltale warmth of accumulating blood. "He won't make it, Corporal," Vance murmured, his gaze distant. "Not in this terrain, not with this kind of internal bleed." Thompson whimpered. "Am I going to die, Doc?" Elias looked into the soldier's frightened eyes. This was the impossible situation. The aid station was 2 miles away, under sporadic shell fire, and evacuation would take at least an hour, likely more. Thompson's chances of survival with such an injury, even under ideal hospital conditions, were poor. On the battlefield, they were practically zero. Elias felt the familiar knot of frustration, a surgeon's instinct trapped within a medic's limited role. He had seen too many men die from preventable internal injuries while waiting for evacuation. He had been trained to open up a human body to repair the damage. Here he was forbidden. Sergeant Michael Miller, hit by shrapnel in the chest just moments earlier, lay nearby, struggling for breath, a sucking chest wound visible. "Just get me some air, Doc," Miller rasped, his eyes wide with fear. 2 men dying from injuries that Elias knew, with the right tools and circumstances, he could address. The conventional approach was failing them, and Vance was keenly aware that something radical, something beyond doctrine, was desperately needed. The lines of duty and ethical obligation began to blur, replaced by a singular, overwhelming imperative: save the lives that were slipping away before him. The catalyst arrived with horrifying clarity on June 11th, during a relentless German counterattack. The 16th Infantry Regiment was dug in near Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, facing heavy machine gun fire and mortar barrages. Casualties mounted rapidly, overwhelming the forward aid stations. Private John Thompson, the abdominal injury from the previous day, was still clinging to life in a foxhole, his condition worsening with each passing minute. The anticipated evacuation had been impossible due to intense enemy fire. Elias Vance observed his slow demise, his gut wrenching. He watched the plasma drip, knowing it was a futile effort without addressing the source of the hemorrhage. He scanned the chaos around him, the sounds of automatic weapons fire, the cries of the wounded, the acrid smell of burnt earth and expended gunpowder. Then his gaze fell upon a discarded K-ration can, a clean, sharp edge, and a small, sterilized field knife from his kit. He had made a decision. It was a decision that defied every regulation, every conventional wisdom, but one driven by an unyielding commitment to preserve life. "Corporal Jenkins, get me all the sterile dressings you have and a bottle of iodine, and fetch Captain Davies, Company C Commander, immediately," Elias ordered, his voice betraying no hint of his internal turmoil. Jenkins stared, bewildered. "Lieutenant, what are you doing?" "I'm going to try to save this man, Corporal," Vance replied, his eyes fixed on Thompson. "He's going to die otherwise. We have no choice." Captain Robert Davies, a no-nonsense officer with a grim understanding of battlefield realities, arrived minutes later. "Vance, what in God's name is happening here?" he demanded, seeing Elias preparing for something far beyond first aid. "Captain, Private Thompson has an internal hemorrhage. If I don't open him up now, he will die. I can stop the bleeding. I can save him." Davies, a man of action but not medical expertise, saw the desperation in Vance's eyes and the undeniable truth of Thompson's fading life. "You're telling me you're going to operate right here, under fire?" Vance nodded. "It's insane, Vance," Davies exclaimed, but something in Vance's conviction held him. "Do what you have to do, Lieutenant, but if you kill him, I'll hold you responsible. Using a local anesthetic if available, or simply relying on the patient's shock and a prayer," Elias began. With the field knife, carefully sterilized as best as possible with iodine. He made a precise incision through Thompson's distended abdomen. Corporal Jenkins, though horrified, instinctively assisted, holding back dressings. The moment Elias opened the peritoneal cavity, a gush of dark blood confirmed his diagnosis. The shrapnel had lacerated a mesenteric artery. Working quickly, his surgeon's training kicking in, Vance located the bleeding vessel. He used fine surgical silk from his kit, meant for suturing superficial wounds, and with incredible dexterity, ligated the spurting artery. The silence that followed, broken only by the distant battle, was deafening. He then meticulously checked for other damage, confirming no major organ perforations. Using more silk, he carefully closed the layers of tissue, his hands moving with practiced precision, despite the dirt, the sweat, and the constant awareness of nearby enemy fire. The entire procedure took less than 20 minutes. Thompson, though barely conscious, was breathing more easily. His pulse began to strengthen. The reaction was immediate and profound. Jenkins, pale but amazed, simply whispered, "My God, Lieutenant." Captain Davies, who had watched the entire procedure with a mixture of horror and awe, shook his head slowly. I wouldn't have believed it. In the context of military medicine at the time, only about 10 to 15% of soldiers with severe abdominal trauma survived to reach a field hospital, and their chances often plummeted further if evacuation was delayed. Thompson's survival, even in the immediate aftermath, was a statistical anomaly, a defiance of established odds. Elias Vance had just performed a battlefield laparotomy, a feat previously considered impossible for a frontline medic, using only rudimentary tools and sheer audacity. He had, against all odds, snatched a man from the jaws of certain death, not by stabilizing, but by intervening directly, radically, and effectively. This was not just first aid. It was the birth of forward surgical intervention in its most extreme form. The desperate act with Private Thompson proved to be not an isolated incident, but the beginning of a grim pattern. The fighting intensified as the 1st Infantry Division pushed through the heavily fortified hedgerows, and the casualty rates climbed. Elias Vance, now known among the men as the Butcher of Colleville, not for malice but for his precise life-saving cuts, found himself performing his insane method with alarming frequency. His initial terror had given way to a weary determination, a psychological progression forged in the fires of necessity. He still hated the brutal conditions, the dirt, the flies, the constant threat of enemy fire, but the sight of a dying man with a treatable internal injury now fueled an unstoppable resolve. On June 18th, near the town of Caumont-Levante, during a fierce engagement with elements of the Panzer Lehr Division, Vance was called to Sergeant Michael Miller, the soldier with the chest wound from days earlier. Miller had been stabilized but suffered another shrapnel hit, this time causing a more severe sucking chest wound and evident internal damage. "The lung has collapsed, Lieutenant," Corporal Jenkins reported, his voice now imbued with a grim professionalism. "He's drowning in his own blood." Miller was cyanotic, gasping. Vance knew the only way was to open the chest cavity and repair the damage. With improvised tools, using a modified K-ration tin opener as a rudimentary retractor, and again surgical silk, he performed a thoracotomy. The metallic tang of blood mingled with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the damp earth. The sounds of battle were a constant backdrop, the rattle of machine guns, the distant thud of mortars, the desperate shouts of men. Vance worked with a focused intensity, his movements precise despite the tremors of exhaustion. He navigated the treacherous landscape of the chest, tying off bleeding vessels and carefully repairing a lacerated lung lobe. The air hissed as the lung re-inflated with a slow, controlled breath from Miller. The collective sigh of relief from the small cluster of men watching was palpable. Excerpts from Elias Vance's personal notes, scribbled on scavenged paper in the flickering light of a dugout, reveal his torment and conviction. June 20th, 1944. Another one. Pivotut Johnson, femoral artery, ruptured spleen. Had to improvise a chest drain with tubing from a canteen and a punctured plasma bottle for vacuum. The terror never leaves, but neither does the conviction that I am doing what must be done. Every man saved is a defiance of this hell. They call it reckless. I call it living. Combat reports, usually dry and bureaucratic, began to include unusual entries. Captain Davies, in his official report, noted, "Lieutenant Vance continues to demonstrate unprecedented surgical intervention under fire. His methods, while unorthodox, have resulted in multiple improbable survivals." Morale among Company C is notably bolstered by the knowledge that even the most grievous wounds might now be treated forward. Private David Johnson, hit by an artillery shell fragment, presented with a compound fracture of the femur and symptoms of internal bleeding from a probable ruptured spleen. This was a case where conventional wisdom dictated splinting and rapid evacuation, but Vance knew the spleen would continue to bleed, and Johnson would not survive the journey. Under a barrage of enemy fire, hunkered down in a muddy ditch, Vance performed a partial splenectomy. His improvised tools now included a sharpened, sterilized bayonet for careful tissue dissection and strong parachute cord for ligatures, boiled in a mess kit. The sight was horrific, yet Vance's calm, authoritative voice cut through the chaos, directing Corporal Jenkins to hold lamps, wipe sweat, and assist in maintaining what semblance of sterility they could. Vance's hands, though stained with blood and grime, moved with the artistry of a master craftsman, fighting for every breath, every heartbeat. The psychological progression was evident in those who witnessed him. Initial skepticism from fellow medics and officers transformed first into reluctant acceptance, then into a profound, almost spiritual awe. They had seen miracles wrought by a man who dared to challenge the very definition of a medic's duty. The crisis point, the true test of Elias Vance's revolutionary method, arrived in the crucible of July 12, 1944. The 1st Infantry Division was engaged in brutal house-to-house fighting for the town of St. Lô, a strategic crossroads that had become a meat grinder. Mortars and artillery relentlessly pounded the urban landscape, reducing buildings to rubble and inflicting horrific casualties. Amongst the chaos, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Thorne, a highly respected battalion commander from a neighboring unit, the 26th Infantry Regiment, was struck by a large piece of shrapnel during an enemy counterattack. His men frantically pulled him from the wreckage of a collapsed building, bringing him to a makeshift aid station Vance had established in a cellar. Thorne was unconscious, barely breathing, with a massive wound to his left chest and abdomen. The shrapnel had penetrated deeply, causing multiple internal injuries. Other medics, including seasoned surgical officers from a nearby aid station, quickly assessed him. "He's gone, Vance," stated a weary Captain Henderson, a surgeon who had just arrived, surveying the catastrophic wound. "Multiple organ perforation, major hemorrhage, no chance here. Get him morphine, make him comfortable." But Vance saw something else. He saw the flicker of a fighter, a life still clinging on, and a complex puzzle his surgical mind yearned to solve. "Respectfully, Captain, I believe there might be a chance," Vance stated, his voice firm. "I can stabilize him. I've done it before." Captain Henderson scoffed. "You've done a battlefield laparotomy, Vance. I've heard the rumors, but this is far beyond that. Look at this." He pointed to the jagged, gaping wound. "The diaphragm is ruptured, lung collapsed, possibly a major vascular injury in the abdomen. We don't have the equipment, the light, or the time for that kind of repair here." Vance did not argue. He simply began preparing. He ordered Corporal Jenkins to ready every sterile dressing, every length of surgical silk, and every painkiller they possessed. He found a clean, flattened canteen cup, sterilized it with iodine, and sharpened its edge with a stone. This was to be his improvised retractor, allowing him to gain access where conventional tools were absent. Under the dim, flickering light of a single lantern, with the sounds of battle echoing above, Vance began. He carefully extended the wound, creating a larger opening. The shrapnel had indeed torn through the diaphragm, lacerating the lower lobe of the lung and causing severe internal bleeding from the spleen and a small bowel perforation. This was an injury that, even in a fully equipped operating room, would be a challenge. With precise, economical movements, Vance used his field knife and the improvised canteen cup retractor to hold back the collapsed rib cage, gaining vital access to the lung. He located the bleeding vessels in the lung, ligating them with surgical silk. Next, he meticulously repaired the ruptured diaphragm. Then he moved into the upper abdomen, locating the severely damaged spleen. With a grim determination, he performed a rapid, partial splenectomy, a procedure that required speed and exactitude. He repaired the perforated bowel, using a technique he had learned in residency, adapted for the brutal conditions. The procedure lasted over 2 harrowing hours. Captain Henderson watched, his initial skepticism slowly transforming into stunned disbelief. "My God," he whispered, witnessing the intricate work. As Vance finally closed the chest and abdomen, Lieutenant Colonel Thorne's breathing became stronger, more regular. His pulse, though still weak, was detectable and steady. He was still unconscious, but he was alive. Vance had not merely treated him, he had performed a heroic full-scale internal repair under the most impossible circumstances. The moment when the method proved itself undeniably came a week later. Lieutenant Colonel Thorne, against all medical expectations, survived his evacuation to a rear hospital, underwent further stabilization, and eventually recovered. His case was thoroughly documented, his survival attributed directly to the impossible surgery performed by Lieutenant Vance in that cellar. Captain Henderson, a witness to the entire ordeal, later wrote an official report detailing Vance's extraordinary intervention, hailing it as a medical miracle and a testament to radical innovation. The word spread, carried by the soldiers Vance had saved and by the officers who had witnessed his impossible feats. Vance's method was no longer insane, it was proof. The undeniable success of Lieutenant Colonel Thorne's surgery and the growing tally of lives saved by Elias Vance triggered a seismic shift in military medical doctrine. Vance's method, once condemned as reckless, began to gain traction. Word of mouth among infantrymen, who saw their comrades return from seemingly fatal wounds, spread like wildfire, reaching higher echelons of the medical corps. Initially, senior medical officers were resistant, viewing Vance's practices as dangerous departures from established protocols. However, the irrefutable statistics and the testimony of multiple surviving soldiers, including a high-ranking officer, could not be ignored. A team of medical observers, led by Captain Henderson, was dispatched to study Vance's techniques. They arrived expecting to find chaotic, dangerous improvisations. Instead, they found a system, albeit one born of desperation, that was logical, effective, and crucially, life-saving. Vance, now granted a reluctant measure of authority, began to train other forward medics and junior medical officers. He demonstrated his techniques for rapid internal hemorrhage control, emergency organ repair, and battlefield wound closure, emphasizing improvisation with readily available materials. He taught them how to identify critical internal injuries that demanded immediate intervention and how to perform the initial, life-saving steps that would buy precious hours for evacuation. This hands-on training, often conducted under simulated combat conditions using captured German uniforms for practice, rapidly transformed how battlefield trauma was approached. The concept of forward surgical teams, small, highly mobile units equipped for advanced life-saving procedures directly on the front lines, began to take shape, inspired by Vance's radical precedent. While full-scale surgical hospitals remained crucial, Vance had proven that delaying complex intervention could often mean death and that aggressive, immediate care, even if imperfect, was superior to waiting. After the war, Elias Vance, whose wartime exploits earned him the Distinguished Service Cross and a reputation as a medical maverick, returned to his surgical residency. His battlefield experiences had matured him, honing his skills and solidifying his conviction in aggressive early intervention for trauma. He became a pioneer in civilian trauma surgery, helping to establish the first dedicated trauma centers in the United States. His wartime innovations, once controversial, became foundational principles in emergency medicine, particularly in the field of immediate surgical response to critical injuries. Many of the soldiers he had saved, like Private John Thompson and Sergeant Michael Miller, sought him out in the years that followed, their lives a living testament to his courage. Thompson, who had miraculously recovered from his abdominal wound, became a successful farmer, often telling the story of the medic who opened him up right there on the battlefield and put him back together. Miller, who had gone on to serve in Korea, credited Vance with not only saving his life, but enabling his continued military career. The long-term impact on military medicine was profound. Vance's experiences directly influenced the development of Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals, or MASH units, in the Korean War, and later the forward surgical teams in Vietnam and subsequent conflicts. The principle of bringing advanced medical care as close to the point of injury as possible, dramatically increasing survival rates for severe combat wounds, became a cornerstone of modern military medical strategy. His story stands as a powerful reminder that true innovation often springs from the most desperate circumstances, challenging deeply entrenched paradigms and demonstrating the extraordinary capacity of individuals to adapt, to dare, and to save lives when all seems lost. The lessons learned in the mud and blood of Normandy, through the audacious hands of one medic, reshaped the future of trauma care, leaving an indelible mark on both military and civilian medicine. Years later, reflecting on the brutal realities of Normandy, the vivid imagery of June 8, 1944, remained seared into Elias Vance's memory. The relentless, oppressive silence punctuated by the crack of sniper fire, the desperate cries of the wounded, and the omnipresent threat of death. He remembered the overwhelming feeling of helplessness as men bled out before him, victims not just of enemy bullets, but of the limitations of conventional medical practice. He recalled the ironic foreshadowing, the ingrained belief that medics were simply to stabilize and evacuate, never to cut, never to truly intervene beyond the most basic first aid. That day, amidst the chaos and the despair, he saw the battlefield not as an obstacle to surgery, but as the only possible operating room. His actions, born of desperation and driven by a brilliant, unconventional mind, were eventually recognized not just by the medals pinned to his chest, but by the countless lives that were saved, and the paradigm shifts in medical practice that he inspired. Elias Vance received the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism, a rare honor for a medical officer, specifically citing his pioneering battlefield surgeries. His methods were taught in military medical academies, evolving into refined protocols for forward surgical units. Textbooks on military trauma care now contain sections directly attributable to the principles he established under fire. He lived a long life, continuing his surgical career with a quiet dedication, never seeking the limelight, but forever defined by those harrowing months in Normandy. His legacy wasn't just in the procedures he performed, but in the courage he instilled, the courage to challenge established norms when lives hung in the balance. He taught the world that innovation under fire is not a luxury, but a necessity, and that human resilience, coupled with unwavering determination, can transform the impossible into the routine. He died peacefully in his sleep, decades after the war, a true hero of medicine. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.